Sagoni, bonjour, young yet. I say greetings. My name is Lisa Cadu. My spirit name is Guerrero Utia. It stands for Strong Flower. I'm a Mohawk from Akwesasne and Tyne-Nega territories. It's an honor to be here today. I was asked to come here and dance. And it's important for everyone to understand. I wear this regalia in pride from my heart. A jingle dress, it's a healing dress. And it's an Ojibwe teaching that I was taught as a little girl. When we wear this dress, we're healing ourselves and the people around us and the people that need healing, that are sick, and Mother Earth that needs healing, and the water. And when we dance for those ones who cannot dance. And we dance to heal everything on that lives in or on Mother Earth. The teaching of the jingle dress is that a man and his daughter was sick, and he dreamt of his daughter dancing in this beautiful dress with jingles. And when those cones that you hear when we dance, it's the prayers going up to the Creator for those healings. And so he prayed and prayed and prayed, and he made this regalia, and he put it on his daughter, and his daughter danced and she healed. So when I dance, I remember those teachings, and I remember that it's sacred to me because I like to heal people. I want everyone to be happy and to be healthy and live on Mother Earth as one. Nyawa.
Hello everyone, my name is Kassie Hill, and I am Mohawk Bear from Six Nations of the Grand River. Welcome to the Indigenous Solidarity Conversation Series. Before commencing this speaking event today, I would like to begin by acknowledging our presence in Gattarakwi, which we now know as Kingston. And more specifically, I would like to acknowledge that we here at Queen's University are situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee land. In recognizing this land, we must recognize its history that predates the establishment of European colonial powers and the hardships, violence, and dispossession that my peoples experienced on this land and throughout much of Canada. Our ancestors faced such hardships to allow us to be here today and represents the continued resilience of Indigenous people. The traditional lands on which we study, work, and live today are sacred to the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and we are privileged to have the opportunity to be situated on this territory. It is integral for us to acknowledge our positionality on these traditional lands as a path towards reconciliation and to reflect on how we can work to meaningfully and respectfully engage with this land and the peoples of this land in all that we do. I would like to begin by saying a big Nyawagoa thank you to our cultural performers, Lisa Cadu, Randy Cadu, and Brian St. Pierre. The Indigenous Solidarity Conversation Series consists of 4 conversational talks. These talks will feature Ian Fanning, speaking with invited guests on topics that explore Indigenous solidarity in various forms and the importance of such conversations at Queen's and in the wider community of Kingston and beyond. We will also examine how we as students, faculty, and members of our community, Indigenous or not, can support Indigenous resistance and resurgence today. I am honored to be here today as your host. To tell a bit more about myself, I'm a third-year Global Development Studies major here at Queen's. I too am the co-president of the Queen's Native Student Association for the 2019-2020 school year. As a proud Indigenous woman, I am honored to be here today to be reclaiming mine and my people's power through education. In my studies and my involvement within the Indigenous community on campus and beyond, I am actively working to decolonize academia and to emphasize the importance of Indigenous narratives in settler discourse. I am passionate about education and hope through my initiatives that I can bring greater awareness to Indigenous history, the issues facing Indigenous communities across Canada, the beauty of Indigenous culture, and the resiliency of my peoples. I now would like to introduce Ian Fanning, who will be featured throughout all 4 of our conversational talks. Ian is a member of Shabbat Abajuan Algonquin First Nation and is an instructor in global development studies and in arts and science online. Speaking with Ian today is Lauren Winkler. Lauren is a Gunyik Gahaga and settler-identified student at Queen's Law with her roots in Tyendinaga. Lauren is committed to learning the various laws of the Ongwehoe, the original peoples, as well as the laws that are more commonly practiced by contemporary Canadian society. Lauren is also dedicated to working with administration, staff, and student governing bodies at Queen's to create a space where both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities will feel safe engaging in reconciliation conversations. Before we begin with today's conversation, we have a bit of housekeeping. Our hope in this series is to share our messages widely, so we encourage you all to record and take photographs as you wish. We do ask, though, that your phones be put on silent for the duration of this conversation. Today's talk between Ian and Lauren will be approximately 40 minutes. As the conversation comes to a close, we will have a 10 to 15-minute question and answer period where we will be accepting questions from the audience here today, as well as those watching from our live stream. Once the question and answer period is over, I will return to conclude today's conversation. Please note that the bathrooms are located out of the doors and down the hall to the right. And if you are in need of accommodations, please see Julia Sullivan. Can Julia please wave if she's here? Okay. She's in pink. Before we officially begin with today's conversation series, it is imperative for us to acknowledge and stand with the Unistono people of Wet'suwet'en. Wet'suwet'en First Nation is located in British Columbia, and for years, Wet'suwet'en has defended their rights to their traditional lands and have expressed concern and outright denial of proposed pipelines that will run directly through their water source. In 2019, things took a turn when the RCMP took up violent aggression at the Unistono camp against unarmed peoples defending their land. Today, Wet'suwet'en once again is being faced by state violence and imposition onto their lands. The proposed pipelines directly threaten the Wet'suwet'en watershed, as well as the plants, animals, and peoples that live off of the land. As Indigenous peoples, we consider Mother Earth to be our nurturer and sustainer. We believe that our relationships with the land is reciprocal. She provides for us, and in turn, we treat her with respect. We as Indigenous peoples, but fundamentally we as human beings, must protect the earth and all that she provides for us, not only for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren that will come after us. Not only are the Wet'suwet'en people defending their land currently, they are defending their lives. These pipeline companies, backed by provincial and federal governments, are threatening violent and lethal action against the Unistono people in the name of profit alone. These big actors are forgetting how truly sacred this land is. They are prioritizing profit over the basic rights of us as human beings. Across Canada, Indigenous peoples are coming together in solidarity to support Wet'suwet'en and to assert our sovereign right to our lands. We urge you all here today to educate yourselves on the situation in Wet'suwet'en and to come together against the colonial violence being perpetrated by these actors. So with this being said, I would like to announce an upcoming event as shown on the screen. On February 6th, there will be a teach-in on defending Wet'suwet'en sovereignty. This teach-in will feature Natasha Steeret and Rebecca Hall. All are welcome and encouraged to attend. It will be in Kingston Hall, room 104. Let us stand with Wet'suwet'en, let our voices be heard, and let's condemn the companies and governments that continue to infringe on the traditional rights of Indigenous peoples. The topics addressed throughout this speaker series are brought forth to raise awareness and to promote Indigenous resistance and resurgence. Some topics addressed may be upsetting to some, and because of this, we will be offering a smudge today at the end of the conversation. Smudging involves the burning of our traditional medicines, cedar, sage, sweetgrass, and tobacco, which have been gifted to us by our Mother Earth. We burn this medicine in a shell, and as smoke is produced, we wash ourselves in it. To do this, we use our hands to waft the smoke onto us. In traditional Indigenous beliefs, smudging purifies and cleanses our minds and souls, allowing us to rid ourselves of negative thoughts and energies. Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples are welcome to partake in this smudge. Al Dockstader from the Office of Indigenous Initiatives will be offering the smudge, and you can help yourself to it at the end of our talk. If you have any sensitivities to the scent or smoke, there is an alternative exit to the right. Thank you, and without further ado, I would like to welcome Ian Fanning and Lauren Winkler to begin our conversation.
much all for coming today. Great to see the room full once again. And now I'll go to you, Lauren, for joining me today. I would like to assure people that Lauren and I did not consult on our t-shirts today, but it's a coincidence that they align nicely with the talk. So thanks again for coming, and maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, Lauren, and your experience broadly with Indigenous solidarity.
So thank you so much for having me and inviting me here today. Nyamagoa to Kassie for opening us up in that very powerful way. I think everyone feels very moved already this morning. Sego Sewak Gwego, my name is Lauren Winkler. As Kassie said, I identify as being Mohawk with my roots in Tyendinaga, and I also identify as having settler ancestry. I personally think it's very important to position ourselves when we're having these kinds of conversations, and it would be, I think, inappropriate for me to come into this talk without also identifying the fact that I do also have settler ancestry and that there's a privilege that comes with that. So I'm currently in my third year of law school here. I'm almost done. I did my undergrad here as well, so it's been a long haul. Everyone at Four Directions is like, when are you leaving? I'm just kidding. It's more me, when am I leaving? Yeah, so it's been a really long time that I've been here at Queen's, and I think about since my second or third year here at Queen's, I've been very involved in student activism for the rights of Indigenous students at Queen's, and then that work has expanded outward a bit, but we'll talk about that soon. Thank you.
Yeah. In terms of Indigenous solidarity and the goals that people have for standing with Indigenous people, you talked a little bit about, in a recent paper I read about, your undergrad and your learning throughout your undergrad and sort of relearning your past and claiming your Indigenous roots. Can you tell us your perspective on Indigenous solidarity, maybe from the time you came to Queen's till now? What do you see as some of the, if we want to say success, some of the successes, and what do you see as some of the barriers still in place?
Wow, okay. There's a lot more anger now than when I was younger. And starting this kind of work. And I think throughout my time at university, I've been learning more and more how complex these issues are and how complex it is to get involved in them. During my time at Queen's, I've experienced lateral violence from the Kingston community because some people didn't agree with the way I was approaching an issue. And that was a really big learning experience for me. And as I said before, learning to acknowledge my privilege and to acknowledge that, I come from a very specific place, and I have a certain experience that is not shared by all. And so, learning that I can't speak for all Indigenous people, which I knew, but I don't think I knew how to articulate that. When I was having these conversations in a way that was open to all and allowed all different dialogues. But I think another big part was learning how to engage settler allies as well. I think it's a really difficult thing to be asked as an Indigenous person. How can I help? I'm here, I have this privilege, I wanna help you, how do I help? I've been in spaces where people have gotten offended, by saying just stand back, people like to assert themselves as allies. You can't do that, we need to name allies. And it can be really difficult to have those conversations, especially using the term settler. I have gotten negative feedback from, I did a allyship workshop for senior admin at Queen's 2 summers ago, I think. And I got negative feedback from some of the participants because I was using the term settler. and they said, well, my ancestors have been here for however many generations. So conversations like that, I've learned how to navigate those, and also to not, I think a difficult thing is not censoring yourself as an Indigenous person to make a settler ally or a settler person feel safer, and not feeling bad for that. Because I think for a long time I was like, oh, I have to make sure that these other people feel safe learning these things, which is important, but it's also important that Indigenous people feel safe, and I think that's the priority. And if settler people have to feel uncomfortable, then that has to happen, and that is something that took me, I would say up until this past year to learn.
Yeah, so much there that you've shared. I wonder if I could just maybe ask a follow-up. You brought up such a wonderful point when you say, we have a lot of requests from settlers and people who want to help, genuinely want to help. But we have this, I think we have a balance that we're struggling to attain, where we have Indigenous people in the academy, in the university, and in the broader community saying we have a lot of work to do and we're not that many. So we need settler allies. And then we also say, but we need to name settler allies. Settler allies don't get to identify themselves. They need to do the hard work with Indigenous communities to be trusted and to be hardworking and to gain that relationship of respect. So I do understand in a way that the struggle that potential settler allies have with where is the balance. We don't want to ask too much of Indigenous people, but we want to help. So you've brought that up really nicely. Another point there is really struggling with the legacy of gendered settler colonialism. And when we're working with settlers to, I really like what you said there, and the way you said it was very gentle. I imagine maybe you could say it a different way. When people push back on that terminology, and we don't want to get stuck on terminology, but pushing back on, hey, my family's been here for generations, but you've still benefited from the legacy of settler colonialism. You've still benefited from that original colonization of Turtle Island. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, protecting Indigenous voices, getting Indigenous voices out there, and pushing back a little bit harder on settler identity, who settlers who Tuck and Yang would say want to employ a settler move to innocence, where they deflect their settler identity in a way that protects them, and they're already protected within the confines of colonialism. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think you put it perfectly when you said, sure, you might have, generations of family that are from this land, but you're still benefiting from the systems that were put in place by the colonizers, that, Indigenous people are feeling all the pollution of, literally and figuratively. It is difficult. It is something that I find a lot in law school. A lot of people don't want to engage in these kinds of conversations because, they feel like, if I refer to them as a settler or, like talk about a history of colonization and, then they feel implicated in that history, people feel guilty, they feel shame, or like you said, to reject those terms, they get defensive and don't want to attach themselves to that history. But that's a huge barrier for us moving forward at all. And we can't, work towards reconciliation if settlers aren't willing to identify that they are settlers. I don't see, the big deal with saying, yes, I'm a settler to this land. My family doesn't have the same relationship that Indigenous people's ancestors do to this land. For myself, I identify as a settler and a Mohawk woman. And so for me, it's hard to understand why other people don't. And I find this a lot when I help Laura Miracle facilitate the Kairos blanket exercise. Not so much since I've started law school, but in my undergrad I was very involved in that. And that is a big thing, I think the hardest thing for people to come to terms with in learning the history from an Indigenous perspective is the fact that we are all implicated in that history, you know, whether we like it or not. And you know, I'm seeing more and more today as well that you know, we're talking about us all being treaty people, and do people understand what that means? And if you were to go up to a person on the street who's non-Indigenous and say, are you bound by any treaties with Indigenous people? They would probably say no, right? But the truth is yes, that if you are in what we now call Canada, you are in a treaty relationship with Indigenous peoples, and we are all bound to uphold that contract. And this is something that I really tried to get across to law students especially, is that we all need to care about these things, and we all need to start seeing ourselves as in this treaty relationship. But in order to do that, you know, settlers need to identify that you are a settler. If you live here, if you're non-Indigenous, you're a settler. And it is a very difficult thing for people to come to terms with, and that's fine, but they need to come to terms with it, in my opinion.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I had a fourth question in our standard questions, but you've already answered it.
Oh.
So,
sorry.
No, this is what I expected. I want to talk, maybe for the rest of the talk, about your experience at law school here, and how some of what you've done in law school your perspectives can actually spill over into the broader community. You've recently shared a paper with me that you wrote in law school. Really powerful piece. I was really impressed when I read it. Just extremely well written with so many good ideas that Queen's University needs to be listening to, as well as the broader community. Maybe just first, could you share just a little bit about that paper?
Sure. So I wrote this paper in the second semester of my second year, so last spring, for a class that is now called Law and Injustice, which is more of a philosophical class. So in class we would talk about things like victimhood and who is a victim, things like who is a settler, how do we navigate these different roles, you know, when we are advocating for changes in Canadian law. It was a really great course taught by Ashwini Vizanthakumar. And so for my paper, I wanted to write about how if Indigenous peoples are ever going to have an equal access to justice in this system that is the Canadian legal system, which we are, I guess, in a way forced to abide by in a lot of senses, then law schools really need to decolonize and accept Indigenous laws as, you know, a third concept of law. So we have the common law, we have the civil law. We need Indigenous laws to also be practiced at the same level with the same amount of legitimacy. And so in this paper, I talk about, you know, my experience as an Indigenous law student, the struggles I've had, the struggles that some of my Indigenous peers have had in law school, and things that need to change in order for us to truly succeed in law school. And I explained in my paper that, you know, Western ideas of succeeding are different than those of Indigenous and many Indigenous communities, you know, where for me as an Indigenous person, succeeding means, you know, I am balanced in all four realms. My emotional, my physical, my spiritual, and my mental are all balanced. And I am going through and doing the best that I can for my community. But in a Western view, succeeding is getting the best grades, and then when you're doing that, your mental, your physical, those things aren't as important. The law school as it is right now is, the grading system is based on a curve. So you are literally, your grades depend on how you did compared to everyone else in your class, and sometimes with the whole year. And this is, I think, super problematic because a lot of Indigenous students, we have that intergenerational trauma that we're experiencing that other students don't. I know Indigenous students who, they're the first in their family to go to law school, where, our classmates, their parents and their parents' parents went to Queen's Law and are lawyers on Bay Street. And so maybe Indigenous students have to get jobs, and they can't spend the same amount of time on the schoolwork as other students can. And so I argue that it's unfair to grade everyone on a curve because not everyone starts at that same level. Mm-hmm. And so how can you be grading everyone at one level when we're all starting at different places? And so even in the Western realm, you're kind of, the law schools are setting Indigenous students up to fail in that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a tangent, but.
Well, what you're saying there is really like it relates to what so many Indigenous students, people in the community, authors, scholars are saying, that we've really got to break down this myth of the level playing field. Mm-hmm. And we keep assuming this myth that this exists in Canada, that we're multicultural, that we're diverse. Even the Queen's pushing for diversity, which is wonderful. Well, we're not there yet, right? Yeah. This assumption in the capitalist colonial paradigm that we're all here and we all have the same opportunities. Mm-hmm. I thought that was really powerful in your paper. Another thing I wanted to ask you about within law school, and then, just if you can try and reflect on, the broader community, you speak really strongly and very powerfully in your paper about your experiences in law school re-traumatizing you. Mm. You speak about that personally, but you also speak about it in a broad way, that the classes on particular cases where Indigenous people are the losers in that case. Mm-hmm. They are always pushed down by colonial law, and by not including Indigenous law as that third piece, that re-traumatization within law school and outside law school is going to continue. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think one of something that was really shocking to me coming into law school, because I had done. In my undergrad, I did my major in history and a minor in Indigenous studies. So I was like, I've learned it all. There's nothing new that law school can tell me about what Canada has done to Indigenous peoples. Like, it's fine. And then I got to law school and I was like, oh wow, I'm so upset all the time. Because you go to class and you're learning about all these cases where this government that has just put themselves onto Indigenous people and are like, you have to follow our laws now. And they were the ones who created this fiduciary relationship, which is really a paternalistic relationship that was completely, completely one-sided. You're going to class and learning about how this government has, made all these laws and all these rules and regulations that make it so hard for Indigenous people to fight for their rights. And it's super, super frustrating, and then you're going to class and people are just debating these things like they're debating whether the sky is blue or gray. Or, is it overcast or is it just cloudy? Like it's nothing, like any kind of like light topic that you're talking about. And as an Indigenous student in that class, you feel super, super targeted, and people usually know if you're Indigenous. And then they, look to you for the answers, and your profs look to you for the answers because, something I find a lot in law school as well is profs are a bit hesitant to step in with their own opinions. They want the opinions to come from students, which can be super frustrating when you feel attacked as an Indigenous student in the classroom, because people don't understand that Indigenous nations are sovereign, and they just don't understand why Indigenous people won't just follow Canadian law, or why they can't just get over it, or why this is even an issue, because Indigenous peoples are going to benefit economically from pipelines, don't you know? I've had that argument many times.
Me too.
Yeah, so I think it's really hard to sit in the class. It's different to hear things you already know, but it's different when those things are being debated, and then when you're in the news and just see all these horrible things happening, on your Facebook, you can't escape it. And then you go to class and then, a prof's like, oh, let's debate this topic. Yeah. And it's not that I don't think these things should be talked about, I do, but I think we need to be more careful with how we're having these conversations. I really think the tone needs to be set. I did have a professor this year in my administrative law class, his name is Jacob Weinrib, who we had a class on the Charter and Indigenous peoples, and he was talking about various cases that established Aboriginal rights, and people were putting their hand up and saying, okay, but if this, then how are they supposed to fight for their rights if they have to go through this whole process? And anyways, students were confused, and he said, exactly. He said, that's exactly the kind of questions we need to be asking, because it is confusing. And look at how big of it, essentially he was saying, look at this barrier for Indigenous peoples to access their own rights, because they have to go through all these complex processes that are time consuming and cost a lot of money. And I think we need to have more conversations like that, where professors are making it clear to students that this is messed up and this isn't right. Yeah. And we need to do something about it. And you, as the future of policy, the law, whatever it may be, you need to be part of the solution. And we need to start having these conversations now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're kind of circling back to this idea that, the settler or non-Indigenous person. And I noticed that tone actually in your paper too, where you're always, I acknowledge that, I realize that, you got to acknowledge all the effort that they're putting in before you can get to actually voicing an Indigenous opinion. You have to acknowledge everything. The settler often feels guilty. And so we can only usually push so far, I think. And that all of that acknowledgement of what the settler's done and how far they've come, thank you, that takes energy, right? I mean, that takes some of your energy away, and it limits how hard we can push. And I feel, quite frankly, that we need to talk quite more direct. I'm tired of, I have a settler background as well as an Algonquin heritage, but I am tired of coddling settlers. I'm sick and tired of it. I'm sick of settlers telling me that they feel guilty. And I'm not trying to break it into a binary, but imagine what Indigenous people are carrying. And you articulate that so well in your paper. You're saying that as soon as I walk through the door into the law school, into Sir John A. MacDonald Hall, that the university will not rename, I feel a burden. I haven't even engaged in class yet. Yeah. And I feel I'm carrying a burden. So you share that so nicely. But then we have to let the settlers sit in their guilt for colonization. I think, as you say, profs and non-Indigenous people, come on, educate yourself a little bit here and do a little more work, because the Indigenous people are, we're doing our work. So I think you've said that well. The other thing I wanted to ask you about with Indigenous solidarity in general, but within the law school too, you've talked about, and you touched on it here, but I wonder if you could let us know maybe how to combat it. But you talked about just this almost, you didn't call it this in your paper, you said it was a disinterest. A disinterest in decolonizing, or just a general disinterest in this work. when I read that sentence, I actually got a little shiver, cold shiver, and I thought, it's really interesting how you stated that. It's kind of this silencing that goes on around the university and in wider society, the silencing of Indigenous people. The Algonquin often are known as a silent people. We just got out of the way. We were pushed out of the way of colonization. But that disinterest, how do you combat that? I mean, you've got some ideas, I think, in your paper, but I did a presentation last Wednesday to a large group of people, and I said, quite frankly, I'm speaking to the converted, always. I'm going to these things and I'm speaking to the people who are interested in decolonizing. How do we get at those people who are not engaged? How do we combat that disinterest? Do you have any thoughts?
You force them. Yeah, at this point, I feel the same. I feel very defeated. You know, throughout most of my undergrad, I was on the Queen's Native Student Association. Now I'm in the Indigenous Law Student Alliance, you know, and we host events, you know, and professors host talks, and it's the same people who come to these things. You know, we know who our allies are, or we know who wants to make change. And so I truly at this point feel like the only way we're going to engage people who don't care, and they don't care. They think it has nothing to do with them. You know, I don't understand why I need to learn this. This has nothing to do with me. I'm getting into corporate law. When am I going to work with Indigenous peoples? You know, and that's why our club hosted a conference last year called Reconciliation on Bay Street to try to appeal to those students to say, even if you're working on Bay Street, you're going to be working with Indigenous peoples. Not one person that I was thinking of who should come to that conference went to that conference. And I think that was kind of like it for me, where I was like, this is not enough. You know, we're putting so much effort into having these kinds of conversations, and the people who need to listen aren't listening. And it's very clear from that racist note that was put up in Chown at the beginning of this year. Someone hosted a coronavirus party on the weekend. When I was an undergrad, there was a racist party. You know, it's very clear to me that Queens has this environment, and it's also clear to me from interacting with the administration at Queens that they don't think it exists. And I don't know if they interact with students or know what the student body environment is like, because that couldn't be more wrong to me. It very much exists. It is the predominant voice at this school. And unless you force those students into classes where their mindset, or where their opinions are going to be challenged, they're not going to be challenged. No. And they're going to keep going. They're going to live in their bubbles of privilege. And this cycle will just continue. There needs to be a campaign almost, or just like a strong voice from administration, from professors, saying this is important and you're going to learn it. Because it's our responsibility as treaty people to learn this, to move forward. In my paper, I suggest, and I've talked to the new dean of the law school, Dean Walters, about this, you know, we need to have courses that teach, that's basically like the Kairos blanket exercise, which is the history of Indigenous Canada relations, Indigenous settler relations, from an Indigenous perspective. We need to teach all our students that. No matter what program they're in, they need to take some sort of course where they can have these conversations, where they can be made to feel uncomfortable. Because as you said, I'm also sick of trying to make everyone feel so comfortable. You know, it's uncomfortable for us every single day, all the time. So I don't feel bad if other people are uncomfortable at this point. Welcome to this uncomfortable space. But there needs to be that education. I can't tell you how many students take the Kairos blanket exercise, or not even students, faculty, staff, adults in the Kingston community who take the Kairos blanket exercise and they're like, wow, I did not know half of this. I thought I knew Canadian history, but I didn't know a lot of this. Why is that? Why are we at this point? And like I said earlier, unless you have that knowledge, we can't move forward, you know? And there's already too much of a burden on Laura Miracle and the cultural safety training volunteers, that we need to have courses and we need to have resources. We need to be hiring Indigenous staff and faculty to be teaching these courses. Because it's my understanding now that Indigenous studies is taught by someone who's non-Indigenous, which is fine, but we need to have Indigenous voices. We need to be hiring Indigenous faculty, and we need to be showing that support. And we need to be forcing students to learn this because they don't care. And until they learn it, they won't understand why it's important for them to learn. And that in this toxic, racist, anti-Indigenous environment is going to persist.
Thank you for those
Thanks.
strong words. Yeah, that's great. I think I got time for one more question, and then I'll just open it up to the audience. Just in general, as we conclude, what advice can you give settlers who want to work with Indigenous people? You talked a little bit about this, but what advice can, what general advice can you give people at Queen's and you know, in the outside community, and maybe what are a few of the common pitfalls?
Okay. My biggest pet peeve is when you can tell when a settler like so badly wants you to call them an ally, and that's not what it's about. It's just about doing the work and helping us out, and it's not about getting recognition for it. I have worked with many people who so badly just wanted recognition for the work that they were doing, and I don't give it to them on purpose. If I think that you are like genuinely, you know, like helping me out and, you know, saying, I'm here for you, what can I do? Just being, if I look overwhelmed, being an extra set of hands, or coming up and saying like, you know, you've probably already thought about this, but like if you want to do anything about this particular issue that's in the news right now, like I'm here to help, but like no pressure on you, you know, like who are coming to me like more as a friend, you know, how you would approach a friend who's in trouble, you know, but then there's other people who are like, I want to do this event, will you speak at it? You know, and they have like one Indigenous person like speak at this event that they put on and they want like all the credit for it, which happens a lot at this university, and I think a lot of other Indigenous people would probably agree. So I think like that's the first thing that we just need to like, we have to stop focusing on this term ally as like an achievement and just think of it as our responsibility.
Yes.
You know, and about relationship, and we're building a relationship here, and you know, using your privilege to work with Indigenous peoples by asking them like what they want, what they need, if they need help with anything, let me know, I'm here. Because another thing that can be difficult, you know, is having all these people who are doing stuff or want to do stuff all come to like the 5 people that they know, Indigenous people that they know.
Yeah.
I am very choosy with what emails I respond to now because my inbox gets very full. And Jan would be the same, and very full inbox. You know, and then the woman at 4 Directions, you know, with drumming requests, speaking, can you write something for the Gazette? There was one 24-hour period where I was like asked 3 times by, I don't know if it was like the Kingston Whig or the Queen's Gazette, I don't know what it was, but 3 times in 24-hour period, and I was like in my 2nd year of law school, so busy, and they just kept hounding me to give them a comment on something.
Yeah.
And we're already so overburdened with work that that's not helpful.
Yeah.
Like I appreciate that you're trying to get Indigenous voices involved, but you have to remember you are just one person. There's 7 other people who are also contacting this person to get something from them, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, I prefer, you know, hey, if you need anything, I'm here to help. Or just checking in once in a while. And so I know to go to that person as a resource if I'm feeling overwhelmed and like I do need to like pull a group together. For me, that's preferred, and not hounding Indigenous peoples to come to something or to speak at something, like if I think it's going to be, if it feels like an equal relationship to me, like this does, then I am more than willing to come, and show up and be there. But I think that's something that settlers are going to struggle with is, offering help, but not too much. Like, I think it is a fine balance.
Yep.
And you're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes, we're human. And I think people are so afraid of making mistakes that they don't engage.
Exactly.
Which is not the answer. Like, I think that's worse. Not engaging is worse, in my opinion. But I think if we all think about this as a relationship, and I just want to help you out as, someone else that's at this university with me, but I know you have a lot on your plate, so if I can help out with that, let me know. Like, I think that, in my opinion, is the best approach.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's probably a really good thing we're running out of time, because I could talk a lot about that.
I know.
Just quickly though, I mean, I go through it, and I know you go through it, and the Indigenous office I know is overloaded. It's great we have new resources, but I'm an adjunct here at Queen's, and I get flooded with requests, and it's often, what can you do for me? I don't get offered tobacco. I don't get offered an honorarium. So it's up to me to ask for those things. I have to write back and say, well, I'm an adjunct. I would like a little bit of money and some tobacco, please. And then I get, tobacco, where do I find that? How do I get that? How do I give it to you? Like, educate yourself, a little bit. Those requests continually come in. And I hear you. I get choosy about which requests. I much prefer to respond to the requests when people write and say, hey, I got this cool idea. Want to work together? Yes. Great. That's a reciprocal relationship that we can engage in, even if I don't know the person. But I'm getting a little bit tired of the requests from full professors here at Queen's who write and say, hey, want to come lecture in my class? Want to come do this thing? Which I'm honored to be invited. But when nothing's offered and they don't even realize I'm an adjunct, like, these things need to be, I'm not trying to go on a personal rant here, but I think a lot of Indigenous people and staff here at Queen's, they go through these things. So we need to think about that when we're looking at allyship and solidarity. So thank you so much for answering my questions and having a great conversation today, Lauren. Really appreciate you coming. I'd like to open it up for a few minutes for questions for Lauren. Jenza.
Bonjour, mashkode bejikakwe and shnabe notsoin and shnabe kweode. Miigwech now for your comments. My question is kind of to flip the question that Ian asked you about settlers and their experience in the university. So what advice do you have for Indigenous students in the university that continue to experience microaggression daily, systemic racism, oppression through their walk at Queen's? What advice do you have for those students to just keep pushing through?
Thank you. Miigwech Janza. Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. That's a good question. First, I would say use your support system. Four Directions has been a huge, huge support system for me. I have gone in there crying or yelling so many times about things that have happened in class. Students saying like that oral history is, how are you supposed to know it's valid, that it's real? Having fights like that with students in class. And I've gone in there crying, and I think just talking to other Indigenous students, faculty, staff about these things is one of the best things you can do, because that's where you're going to get that genuine validation and someone to share that anger with you. But outside of other Indigenous people, knowing your settler allies who can do their best to understand as well. I love to rant, if you couldn't tell. So that for me is like my best medicine is just being able to, you know, if I'm feeling all this energy, this anger, just be able to, you know, release it all. Doing ceremony, a lot of times if I'm really worked up, my 2 housemates are here and they will attest that sometimes all 3 of us have come home after a class and just need to, you know, cleanse ourselves with sage, because that's the only thing that's gonna do it. Drumming, I also find really, really helps me if I feel like I'm losing my voice. Drumming helps me feel like I'm gaining my voice back. But outside of, you know, your system of support, I wouldn't be afraid to call out things for what they are. But that is me having, and Jansa, you've been here for probably almost as long as I have, in this environment anyways. And you know, maybe that's just me being comfortable enough to call things out at this point in my time at Queen's. But I do think people need to be called out when they're saying inappropriate things and be told why it's inappropriate and how it makes you feel. Because I think too often people get away with things, and you go home feeling so hurt and they go home feeling nothing, like it hasn't bothered them at all. They didn't know that they said something. And sometimes that's with profs. And it's uncomfortable to call profs out. I remember in my 4th year, I was taking First Nations politics, and my professor called treaty rights benefits. Yeah, the gasp was it, yes, the correct reaction. I put my hand up and I explained, you know, these aren't benefits, these are agreements that were made between Indigenous peoples and what is now the Canadian government. And I felt the need to say that because I was like, I can't let my classmates go away calling these benefits. You know, I already get asked, oh, well, isn't your tuition all paid for? Like, you guys don't pay taxes, and you know, all these things, all these misconceptions that people already have. You know, I felt like I couldn't leave that space without saying something. So I did, and it was very poorly received from my professor. And I think I went to one other class after that, and came out with a B or something, so it's fine. Whatever. But, you know, like, I think, you know, people need to be called on this stuff, and maybe they shouldn't be teaching these courses if that's how they're going to be teaching it. I've gone to the Dean of History before because I felt that, you know, certain, either whether it was a teaching fellow or a TA or a professor, if I felt that something wasn't being taught right, I would go straight to the dean and say, listen, you need to do some sort of training or something because this is the experience I'm having in your class and it's not right. And I think that's okay to do. You know, I think professors and, you know, administration, and I don't mean to insult anyone, but I think they forget why they're here, and it's for our experience. That's literally what you're all paid to do. Make sure we have a good experience, right? And that's what we're paying for, is to have a safe educational experience. And I do think, and this is having interacted with many administration, I'm not just saying this, I think people forget that. And I don't think that it's wrong to remind them or to let them know what the reality is. They're not in the classroom always, right? And I think sometimes we need to remind them or tell them what the experience actually is. It's not rainbows and kittens like you might think it is. It is war sometimes. Sometimes it feels like you are in war in class. And I think that's something that they need to realize so that they can make those changes. Thank you for your question. I hope that was sufficient.
I think do we have time for one more?
We have time for one more question. And Alan Daxter, if you're here and you could set up the smudge, that would be great. There he is. Okay. One more question, either from our online or from our...
Smudge?
Mary Drinkwater, and I teach at the Faculty of Education. And I'm just going to build on, because you brought so many points out, and I can hear the frustration. And one of the questions was, how do you do this? And I saw you kind of laugh when you said force, But policy is one thing. I teach a course right now, Policy and Models in Canadian Aboriginal Education. So it's good to offer the courses, but it's more about the pedagogy that's used. And when you're talking about what professors should be doing here, the challenge is in most institutions of higher education, professors are given no pedagogical training. So you have two great allies with the new principal coming in who is really committed to try and work in this area, and with Jan. And I think going to them and saying, I teach a 5-year program at the University of Malta, 2 professors, before you can apply for your next promotion, you need to take a pedagogical course. And in that pedagogical course should be the decolonizing pedagogy, critical pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy that all professors should at least be introduced to if they haven't in the past. And I think they're not force, but policy and programming, I think, could be a way to at least start to introduce more change.
I do agree with that completely, but I also think the university really needs to be hiring Indigenous peoples to instruct and share that knowledge as well. You know, I think, you know, the Office of Indigenous Initiatives has, I think, still has like a person who, you know, does that kind of training with professors, whoever at the university needs it. But I think there's only so much that settler professors can do to make those changes. We need Indigenous people in this institution to decolonize it. And I agree that efforts like that definitely need to be discussed, because how are settler professors supposed to teach this if they don't fully understand where it comes from, right? In my paper, I talk a lot about how we need to, the school needs to do more land-based courses, because I speak specifically about law because all of our laws come from the land. But how is a non-Indigenous professor supposed to teach that unless they know about our pedagogy, and know why it should be a land-based course, right? And I think, yeah, so I think there needs to be a mix of both, definitely. And I think those are 2 things that I would very strongly encourage the university to do, is invest more in land-based courses. Because not only is that where our teachings come from, and that is that not only our most important relationship, but it also to teach empathy to non-Indigenous settler students. I think the best way to show someone to be humble and to teach them what it is to be humble is to get them on the land, because then you see how small each of us are individually in this on this planet, right? Because there's so much more, and beyond. There's so much more to life than just us. And I think that's a lesson that, you know, we could all benefit from. So the land-based courses, and then also, yeah, providing more training for Indigenous or non-Indigenous professors and hiring Indigenous professors. We need more people who are qualified to do this work, because right now I think a lot of non-Indigenous professors don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They're like, I don't know how to incorporate this. I don't want to teach in a disrespectful way. You know, I've heard all kinds of different responses. They don't feel it's appropriate for them to teach on that topic. You know, I have some professors who are great and will bring in Indigenous lawyers or elders or whoever it may be to teach on these subjects. But we need more than that. It needs to be more permanent than that. Thanks, you for your question.
Great response. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you
and
so much.
Your strong words are medicine for us all.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to invite Kassie to close for us.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren and Ian, for a great conversation. That was really powerful, and I think there were very important things said. Thank you as well to our culture performers, Lisa, Randy, and Brian. Thank you to Al Dockstader for providing us with the smudge. And thank you all for being here today and for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for the work you all are doing to further Indigenous solidarity and to work towards reconciliation and allyship. Thank you to all of you here today in Mitchell Hall. Thank you to those watching online, and as well to those listening to CFRC. Your participating in the Indigenous Solidarity Conversation Series is greatly appreciated, and we encourage you to continue educating yourselves and to continue the path of reconciliation. I would also like to acknowledge the Principal's Dream Course and funding provided by the Committee of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Indigeneity, for without these two avenues, this conversation series would not be possible. Our next speaker series will take place on February 25th and will feature Janice Hill, who will be speaking on Indigenous people and inclusion. Tickets are going very quickly and they are available via Eventbrite, so be sure to get those. Again, Nyawagoa. Thank you all.